I just remember that I didn't go onto this topic, which I sort of said that I would, right at the start, talking about how people are, inverted commas, fundamentally different from one another. Um, this is slightly speculative, but I just wanted to point out that essentially what this means is that people. So, like, there are many different types, obviously, and putting metagram aside and just focusing on metatype, um, which has features within it which are much more broadly shared, because then basically these pairs are going to be pretty stable in terms of their occurrence in other people. Um, in terms of just a population. So it's interesting as well. So basically, if you have a pair of functions in your structure of the four sides of the mind, there's a high chance that that you're going to have someone in your vicinity that has the same pair. It's obviously not necessarily going to be the exact same type as you, but people that are in the same vicinity will very likely have the same pairing featuring in one of those other slots. And so in some sense, people can really influence each other by showing the same pairing in a different light, having the same cognitive, sort of ambit, but in a different capacity, deployed in a different facility of a different side of the mind, and you can see that potentially modeled, or you can sort of, and there are also other things that can occur. Like, so for example, within one person, there is a particular chain that is occurring, right? Because it's these interlocking pairs that are sequential. And so you could also, I'm imagining that there are perhaps, could be a model of spiritual technology in some sense. You can find other people who almost dovetail in terms of, or intersect in varying different patterns. And so you can imagine that certain configurations of people working together, or being interconnected in some sense, what effect that could have in terms of being able to almost extend one's cognitive reach by being part of like a cognitive network that could perhaps even circumnavigate the entire all the dimensions of psychological reality. So you could imagine yourself as part of a kind of tapestry in which everything is being sort of garnered in some sense, although I'm not going to be talking about, there are a million ways of interpreting this, but this is, I think, is worthy of consideration when understanding group dynamics and such. And there's another thing that has to be pointed out, is that if you can understand that let me say this, so you might also find that there's a special kind of relatedness that occurs with people who are in the same sort of vicinity in terms of their metatype, because then their value their value centers, in terms of the first one being the unconscious mind, the second one being the ego, and the last one being the kind of the meta drama that is sort of having some dissonance, kind of that is trying to be repressed by the unconscious, that is immediately trying to be tackled by the unconscious, while the ego is sort of into rehashing all the kind of the nebulous elements around that, but that if you can find someone who has your superego value pair, but they're modeling it in their ego or their unconscious, you might be able to extract some kind of allegiance from them, perhaps, if you can extract agreement from them, that it might sort of, in a weird way, empower the ego against the unconscious, and also perhaps make the unconscious vulnerable to the superego. Anyway, like, you know, there's quite a convoluted dance occurring. So this is all, I'm being vague on purpose because I'm not thinking through all of these things, but it might also be the case that almost like serial networking between people and creating these longer value chains. They might have a rather sort of brittle quality to them, but also what I wanted to say is that you might also find that in the population in general, that there is something, and this is hard to say because on some level it doesn't work, because there's an odd amount of dimensions of psychological reality. There's 17, not 16. So that means that some people, in some sense, will kind of, wherever you kind of virtually draw the partition, perhaps, or if, of where the beginning and the end, where the end and the beginning sort of occurs, within the series, that some types, because there are types that that fall on top of the partition, that have, because it's a virtual partition, so the type doesn't just arbitrarily stop as you near the end of the dimensions of psychological reality. It just goes past 17 and into 1, dimension 1, and then 2 and 3 and 4. So you can have types that start in the high numbers and get into the low numbers. But anyway, my point is that there might be a almost, and this might be arbitrarily sort of non-linear as well, because there might be some sections in which certain groups of people are able to kind of collaborate with each other just because of the kind of the symmetry of how their structures stack up. So you might find that people that are clustered around each other in terms of their type architecture are better at coordinating and sharing values that are culturally manifested than others. So there could be a kind of, there's going to be a non-linear correlation because of the uniqueness of all the dimensions. And other clusters of type might be very antagonistic to one each other, especially the ones perhaps around dimension 6, because of the kind of the ionic nature of that. And so if some people have these pairs, right, of these dimensions, and then another person, they have their whole architecture that's kind of, it's not one pair, different. It's half a pair different. It's like their pairs, if you can kind of work with the logic that like a hero and a child is like has a positive spin, and a parent and an inferior function has like a more negative attitude. That it's doing more work, and it's not actually like it's sort of it has a more negative connotation in how it's sort of expressed in general. Just take that generalistic sort of rule that you can see that people that would then on some of their pairs they would be inverted. So like what would be one person's what is one person's inferior is another person's parents. There's that kind of mismatch which would happen if they were one pair different, dissimilar. But if you're half a pair dissimilar, then you get the difference between your parent is the other person's child, or your inferior is the other person's hero. No, that's not right. No, that is right. Yeah, so your inferior or parent, or your parent would be their inferior. Your parent would be their child or their hero. So types that are immediately adjacent in terms of their starting points or reference to the shared model of dimensions of psychological reality could be almost, because of their immediate vicinity, somewhat incongruent. And then types that are like have or two dimensions displaced might then have a more synergistic kind of interrelatedness. What else is there? What else was this? And I was thinking that this might actually conform to a distinction between, and I don't think that people that then, so I was thinking that there might generally be a kind of broad distinction between people who are like, let's say, starting on an odd number or starting on an even number, although would be like systematically different, but some people in some sense will break that rule because they will go from dimension 17 to dimension 1, and so then they have two odd numbers sequentially, and so so it's like some people would actually have both, like you can't just you can't distinguish people and say they are odd and they are even, because there are some types that it's going to be somewhat an arbitrary distinction, or it could work relative to a certain set of types, but then there might be someone in that bunch in which that distinction would break down as a uniform kind of sorting method. Anyway, I just thought that these were interesting things to point out. But also that the difference between odd and even on those grounds could also explain some, like, how some people are more prone to a certain groupthink and cult, type belief that is just kind of in tune with the messages that work for the psychology of that set of people, or that kind of, because as soon as you start making consistent patterns, especially because of how the structure and the architecture of the false ego operates, that if you make an argument that works for that pattern of pathology or something like that, it's going to at least be in league with echoing of the same rubric of value structures that are constructed in that continuing pattern. But obviously it's more sophisticated than that, because in the continuing pattern, but basically what I'm trying to say is that, like, there's going to be a kind of abstract rule book which is somewhat consistent, although it's going to be different. It's going to be like a kind of, it's a whole new level of the same thing. It's like an analogous play. When I say play, I mean like a play in a kind of tactical maneuver in a sport game. It's like a sort of repurposing the same kind of something. Okay, anyway. And so in this sense, you could roughly perhaps see that there are, in some very general nebulous sense, that there are like two vague different worldviews that, perhaps even have internal contradictions, but that it seems that you can almost in a very sort of unsophisticated way, that you could say that, there are these two stacks of attitudes, perhaps on the level of political or ideological interpretation, that just seem to, like, be part of almost like a cultural dynasty of people buying into them, and this is, and I mean, this sort of works on the level of mimetic, kind of transmission, that people that you trust are people that have congruent value structures. And so, it's basically like, I'm not saying that, these people could not be deprogrammed, but I'm just saying, it's sort of, it makes sense that how echo chambers would be constructed, out of this kind of psychological sort of confirmation bias. at a kind of at a generalized population level. Um, but I think that people with some, it's not as if people that are on the other side of the cognitive, sort of divide can't be an adherent to what is in some traditional or conventional sense within the generalized scope of things. They don't have the ideology which would, um, be stereotypically sort of thought to apply to them. But there are these archetypes, there are these stereotypes that at least can be um, collected and curated. I do think that there is a general tendency within people um, to garner generalizations. It's a choice as to how one deploys them and how one monitors them, in terms of the application of morality and a normative value system, um, to a degree, hopefully, that you would think that it becomes a complete non-issue. That there can be some idea of politeness. And I'm going to go straight into politics, I guess. But it is very, very fucking strange how political correctness is somehow directly correlated with history. And then how that historical narrative is treated as a kind of causal rule book which is still in force. That's just sort of assumed at the beginning. And that all correlations of anything occurring in the present is because of filtering it through the historical interpretation, as in history, as if history is the only determining factor of anything. And even if, and it must just be taken because of the correlation to be that history must be the causal force. And I guess this really works only on the level at which you can abjectly just kind of expect that everyone believes in determinism. As the thing that makes the world go round, as the thing that makes anything happen. So you don't believe that it's actually looking at things in the present, in the light of the present, and in actually specific knowledge as to how things function and how they should or might function, and making a policy or a plan in accordance with looking at things in the present. You are forced into correlating them with similarities in history and taking history as being that it should at least be the thing that is treated as causative because the correlation is similar enough. And so let's just take on the task of fixing history because that symbolic enterprise proves our virtue. And it's so evil on so many different ways because it dehumanizes people, but it also completely destroys the functioning of anything secular because it means that you have to first validate the historical interpretation as causative before you can even attend to anything. By choosing to take the correlation of problems to a historical model of causation, you have forced a very artificial kind of adjudication of history and projecting that adjudication onto the present and forcing people to play their role, and you're forcing that very abject view of categorization as the prerequisite to even getting away with this sort of project. And so to have this project in the working, to have it to be engaged in performing it, you have already imposed a kind of orthodoxy of a worldview in which people must be seen first as an identity, and the rectification and redemption and compensation of identity is the foremost project. And so people have to get things on behalf of their identity, not because of their individuality. And so you do things for the wrong reasons. You're actually somehow, everything that happens to people is because of their identity. It is so dehumanizing and degrading and fundamentally racialist, or whatever identity feature that you're using. It's identity essentialism. And that doesn't matter if you want to try and make a special description in which you are divorcing yourself from being an essentialist. If you take the history as causative because it's, I guess when I keep on talking about the causative narrative that is being deployed and projected onto the present, I mean, fundamentally, it's not the present. I mean, I would say that it is performing a very egregious error, and it's creating a lot of problems on the present. But I would say technically the error that it is making is that actually it's saying that this is the model of the solution, that is how the future, thinking about the future, planning about the future, designing the future, designs for the future must be run as a reaction to this causal narrative. And whether or not you want to attach racial essentialism to that project or not, I mean, it's irrelevant, because it's somewhat tacit. Like, you can relabel what it is that you're doing. It doesn't really make a difference what you call it. It's still obnoxious bigotry and dehumanizing, and it's also, it forces you to treat people as tokens. It also forces you to find a scapegoat to extract from. But I mean, eventually, it is just fundamentally toxic, because how can anyone inhabit a society with people who consider themselves of a fundamentally different identity, faction, that is, and these factions are their own separate, sort of conglomerates. And if you're going to promulgate a whole political agenda that instantiates that effectively means that there's no such thing as class mobility of individuals. It's somewhat progress as an identity block, as an identity faction. You've completely broken down civil society at that point into a vehicle for the progress of blackness or whatever. And it doesn't matter if you want to define that progress of blackness as racial essentialism or not. I mean, it's so fake to even hear people sort of disown racial essentialism, but then say things that are like, it's just amazing how delusional people are. I mean, do you not think that the Nazis thought that they were fighting for social justice? I mean, do you not see that this is the exact same worldview? This is how they categorize society. It's just they understood that you cannot have a state that serves more than one master. There's no way that you're going to be able to broker collective guilt and collective and the redemption of a kind of collective shame without endorsing mascots for each group and having those mascots or leaders somewhat facilitate the social justice by compensating, extracting compensation or justice on behalf of the collective. So you need to actually create these sorts of these great symbols, which eventually, they all eventually coalesce into what you can only call the Führer principle, the savior of the identity matrix that will adjudicate and intervene and be the hidden hand, like in the One Ring, and give the invisible power that will sort of frame and facilitate what should be happening, as everything is ordered into their different casts of their different numbered rings. 9 rings for the realms of men and 7 rings for the elves and whatever it may be. So I mean, at some point there is a drive to have one's own separate territory where you're not confronted with other people's narcissistic injury groupthink, because it's so toxic and vile to be subjected to being spoken at, to sort of have this narrative being spoken at you, which you can even complain that the narrative is a you can construct an argument that the narrative paradigm, the causal narrative paradigm, is just toxic garbage and it leads nowhere, and you make an argument, but because no argument is ever made for the causal narrative, it's just sort of spoken at, and you are automatically incepted into it. It automatically is assumed that it owns you. The framework inception really is almost the best word for it. And it just begs the question, so you could be literally soliciting and fully addressing the core kind of schism and problematic issue, and you make a whole argument, but because there is no argument for the causal narrative, it's just read at you, and therefore it's just sort of invasively imposed that it pertains to you and you pertain to it, and so you must just make yourself prone to it and available, and these people have, disgustingly, that they have actually corrupted the courts, or at least the constitutional court has bought into the Promotion of Equality Act, which is fundamentally poisonous and is antithetical to the Constitution. But Sadly, the Constitutional Court has actually made quite a few decisions which show that they don't believe in strong constitutionalism. They effectively are just reading their ideology into it, which is ironic because of how antithetical it is to the Section 1 values of the Constitution. It's really quite disgusting. It seems the writing really is on the wall. We're going to need, at the very least, we need a revolution against the Constitutional Court, which I don't understand how it can be reformed. We're going to have some kind of ulterior court system. Perhaps a partitioning of the country as well. Also, this is quite sad and tangential. Actually, just to have a full record of this, so it's somewhere in my voluminous recordings of these long diatribes. Let me just read a comment that I made on a YouTube video that pertains to this issue, just so I have it somewhere in my videos. Where was it? So I was commenting, I'll read out the name of the video. It's from the channel FMF video, which FMF stands for the Free Market Foundation. So this says channel FMF. The name of the video is The Rule of Law and Judicial Contempt for Liberty in South Africa, Martin van Staden. So I said, this was an excellent presentation, so thank you for that. I would like to make a specific comment that I hope might be further elaborated on in the future when broaching the issue of affirmative action. I believe that the Constitution should be understood as not allowing for affirmative action as it is currently conceived of and understood to be in two separate dimensions. Not only that it can't be used on race or biological sex, but that it can't merely impose a criterion of direct discrimination, and that the only form of valid affirmative action is special policy designed to provide remedial support and resources that bridge or bolster the credentials of people who fall into whatever designated program that is specifically crafted in terms of Section 9 of the Bill of Rights, subsection 2, I believe. So that basically only affirmative action in the form of extended or subsidized training or extra assistance offered through the state to repair or attend to specific disadvantages that the affirmative action is particularly aiming to ameliorate is the only sort of affirmative action which the Constitution condones and empowers government to sanction, i.e. special educational interventions and programs that provide extra schooling or tutoring within certain contexts, institutions or industries, or other forms of remedial support, in brackets, programs designed to promote access to transport, healthcare, housing, as a part of a way to assist the credentials or specifically designated groups of persons within some envisioned context that is deemed an effective way to facilitate clear benefits, i.e. the connection of business with people who could be uplifted through a well-crafted policy device that fixes a problem connected with disadvantage, so that the specific disadvantage targeted is individually mitigated or alleviated. This is the context in which equality is enhanced by specific measures that are vulnerable to challenge from the rule of law and other provisions of the Constitution. Basically, affirmative action mentioned in the Constitution, it is literally a crutch that has a specific remedial action. Its effects should be should be measurable on the individual scale of the recipient, and it should not apply indefinitely to the specific recipient which it affects, as that would, by definition, mean that it was not alleviating the disadvantage, but instead would be some kind of endless compensation program, which would generally be unjustifiable to devote resources to. That's, I'm just talking. When I say that, I mean that in terms of the limitations clause. I'm kind of referring to the limitations clause. And the kind of balancing that has to be done in a country that is effectively not rich. But affirmative action has no rational basis or connection to the notion or functioning of a welfare program, which is also responsible for the toxic proliferation of identity consciousness and racialist poisons, which the betrayal of the Constitution is currently facilitating. Okay, that's slightly unclear. What I meant by that is that if you treat affirmative action as a welfare program, that is creating a toxic proliferation of identity consciousness and creating a kind of racialist poison that inculcates the betrayal of the Constitution. And so affirmative action has nothing to do with directly skewing the field in order to create some ideologically approximated balance. Although even in the affirmative action I spell out, there is an indirect discrimination taking place, as people who do not fall into the designation for the affirmative action policy are being discriminated against, although this is fair because of the remedial effect and nature of the constitutional mandate providing for the use of affirmative action. Government has simply been lazy in wishing to deploy a neo-apartheid racialist agenda which has led to the positivistic corruption of the law, legal theory, and the endorsement of cultural authoritarianism, within the twisted morality of a racialist imagination and consciousness of a collective and systemic salvation, under some centralized orchestration of an invasive and imposed moral orthodoxy. We truly live in the dark times of a ravenous slave morality that has not emerged since Weimar Germany promulgated its project of Aryan studies and the incubation of its Führer principle, which is basically what we have today in terms of the race and gender studies which is being promulgated by our corrupted universities, whose academics should face legal sanction for their constitutional damages. They should, at the very least, lose their jobs. They can go teach in other countries that want to foment that kind of racialist imagination and that vile and disgusting, very. I mean, the only way to describe it is that it's fascistic. I mean, it is the pseudo-intellectual foundation of any fascistic movement. Anyway, I'm going to continue reading my comments. What follows is a separate topic that I didn't have the energy to properly edit, so sorry for the many repetitions of the same point. At the moment, I am wondering how feasible it would be to break up the country and establish a legitimate constitutional court to preside over, at the very least, the Cape Judicial Territory. But without a mobilized political faction that holds enough democratic weight and the communication towards establishing such a revolution, it would be hard to manage or accomplish this idea. Perhaps if some coordination of a tax revolt, with some open discussion about the feasibility of a Western Cape-based secession from the national government, which would already be legally facilitated by the Western Cape's own constitution, could all be done within the framework of upholding constitutional supremacy, which necessitates taking into account the political reality that the country as a whole is not interested in bearing the weight of constitutional supremacy, although this is largely unproven because there is no media coverage or mobilized elite canvassing support for the constitutional turmoil and betrayal that the state is currently perpetrating. So, it's not necessarily tested because there's no established political party that is actually talking about the betrayal of the Constitution by the Constitutional Court and by the state at large. So, anyway, I mean, anyway, so it is perhaps, I continue to develop this point. It is perhaps necessary to start with a judicial revolution, or even a mock judicial revolution, as a political stunt and testing grounds, with a vision to developing first a well-established alternative political and legal framework to the status quo that will eventually use some quorum of judges to displace or politically establish, uh, to have an ulterior politically established trigger, um, that activates, uh, that rebel constitutional court, and condones its collection of ulterior judgments and vision of the legal system. Sorry, I'm sort of ad-libbing slightly just to make the grammar flow a bit nicer. And then get a separate stand. Okay. So in the meantime, generating a separate standing enough to engineer political allegiances to form and coalesce. This might even be done totally legally, as it could be done as a mock exercise purportedly to create publicity, to eventually become a big enough peaceful political issue to generate the support required to displace the current constitutional court and its corrupted ideological machinations, and unwillingness to defend the constitution. That is the basic problem, is that we have a constitutional court that is unwilling to defend the constitution against a corrupt state that is promulgating this legal positivism and very toxic racialist fomentation that has now is really coalescing as black fascism. I mean, we're basically reliving Weimar Germany in South Africa. I mean, that's what, and we even have the same political atmosphere internationally as what happened in Weimar Germany. Is there's this tremendous sympathy for the spirit of black fascism, because blackness as an identity needs to be endorsed to sort of fix all these things, So it really shows you just, I guess, how much sympathy you should historically have with the Germans, because, no one's learnt anything and it's happening all over again. And so it really just shows you how disconnected people are from, let's say, moral principles and normative standards, which all just get thrown under the bus as soon as someone wants to correlate and reduce issues to identity, and not actually see about how these political machinations actually impact things on the ground, and how actually they facilitate corrupt elites doing whatever the fuck they want. Anyway, there's always this tremendous sympathetic codependency between the revolutionary so-called ideology and this sort of this political elite. This idea that, oh yeah, let's get rid of the elites that we've been scapegoating for generations, and replace them with a breed of political elites that share something with us called identity. Because when they are rich instead of the old elite, even though they were the ones stitching up the old elite the whole time and sabotaging everything, because the only thing that was ever allowed to work was via their very rigid self-sabotaging machinations of facilitating the identity foremost before treating individuals with any kind of rule of law and systematic, stable set of institutional, secular, commonly shared values that could actually be used to, that's how culture is supposed to work, is that it translates. I mean, you have conventions, you have generalizations, so that people can actually have a general common held view about how things work and how things should work. And so once you've got that kind of default, it doesn't mean that things can't be out of the norm, but once there's a general agreement about how defaults work, then you actually have a way to plan and do things, and you have also a position with which to start with that you can then start to develop and progress. You actually have to conform yourself to a sense of reality, to a sense of the present, and not try to argue with the history where everything is just this kind of imaginary convoluted mess of possibility that is trying to be extracted from the history via the medium of the present, and sort of forgetting things selectively and conveniently to fit that very simplistic reduction of how that somehow the solution is somewhat antithetical to how the problem is defined in that very rigid and delusional way, is the only way to describe it, really. I mean, it's really self-indulgent when you hear these people give their historical ranting. Um, which somehow that's supposed to just substitute for talking about economic and financial and just any practical or pragmatic sort of consideration just somehow just evaporates in the hysteria, in the literal hysteria created by the immediacy of the narcissistic injury. Sorry, let me just continue at this point then. The rebel court could amass rulings that it files as merely dissenting opinion without effect until some quorum or political trigger can activate them, or until some political trigger is found to facilitate the activation of its better body of judgments. Its judgments could create a corpus of some political and judicial rubric, at the very least, for provinces to officially move towards disassociation from the Union of Provinces in order to uphold the supremacy of the Constitution. I mentioned it before, although I didn't substantiate the point, but the Western Cape is already positioned to do this, because the Constitution of the Western Cape has at its foremost allegiance and its foremost grounding value is the supremacy of the Constitution. That's what it says. It's the supremacy of the Constitution, not the Constitutional Act of 1993 or 1996. It's just the supremacy of the Constitution, the people's document, not the thing that might be amended by the Assembly or something like that. And when you've got a court which is unwilling to uphold the supremacy of the Constitution, and you've got the political reality of what the state is, I would say the Western Cape is well within its ambit of, obviously, to practically facilitate this, you would need a quorum of judges that would endorse it, and you would also probably need some kind of military force. You would need a defection of some amount of the military. So that would be, to immediately try to ameliorate the people, at least for the people that live in the Cape Judicial territory. There's so many things that need to sort of. South Africa spends the most money. We have like a higher proportion of our GDP spent on education than like Asian countries, I think. It's pretty ridiculous how much money we spend on education and just how much money is wasted. It's so inefficient. It's so disgusting. I mean, there must be a lot of money being stolen. Or I mean, or the unions as well. Like the teaching unions are. I mean, it's like a state of emergency. But you know, I mean, the way really to fix it would be to just have a voucher system, so that at least you could have better run schools develop, um, and try attract better quality teachers that don't sort of entrench themselves in this. It's amazing how this culture as well of affirmative action has sort of you there was a trend of this, I think, even in America, where people had these jobs which they would not know how to do, but it was like they were advertising themselves as professionals without any real credentials, and the job that they were doing was like their form of activism, that they should be paid almost as a token of their of that. They felt that if history had been different, then they would have been that professional or something like that. It's that kind of weird, kind of disorientating interpersonal invasiveness that's just so dislocated from reality that it yeah, I mean, you can only call it provocative, and then obviously the real solution is the only way to avoid that kind of provocation is just to fall into ethno states, and this is why Hitler called these people useful idiots, because they spread fascistic values, they promulgate and promote fascistic values by their abuse, by their narcissistic abuse, which they inflict on people by speaking the narrative at them and forcing the narrative, forcing them to take the burden of the narrative, to be the scapegoat. So it's this projection that you speak the narrative at someone, and then they have to impose the role on themselves that is appropriate in correlation to the narrative, and everything must be done in correlation to the narrative. And so the narrative is the mediator of everything that happens, and then you need to establish these ad hoc administrations that facilitate the mediation of the narrative, which is basically what is already emerging in South Africa, where you have this corrupt constitutional court, you have this corrupt state with the corrupted notion of the rule of law, and you even have a corrupted moral political arena, where even the opposition parties, the big opposition party, they buy into this political consciousness, they buy into this fascistic morality circus, where they are vying to be the paternalistic representative, bringing justice to the identity, mediating the causal narrative, to help people better project that narrative at people, and to speak that narrative at people, and to make them objects that correlate to the narrative. That is the voice of these people. They are fascists. And they have allies at the moment. They have allies in a disreputable constitutional court that does not deserve its status. We have the best constitution in the world in South Africa. We have the best legal system in the world. I'm not just saying that. I mean, like, I have also developed, as I've spoken about this topic in some of my other videos. I mean, it's the only surviving Roman law in the world. We actually have a corpus of general principles of law, which is in the common law system. It looks like that Britain might be going through a constitutional development at some point. Um, they have other things in their politics that is actually probably better. Um, they their West If they can preserve more of their Westminster system. Um, how our parliament in South Africa is run is pretty embarrassing. Um, how it hasn't been developed um, to sort of have the right kind of balance of the constitution in terms of being able to protect um, or defend how the speaker has not been able to defend the constitution against the fascists. But that, is also because there's very little political will, I guess, to do that in the times that we live in. But how they would have to be developed is not that easy when we don't have as many sophisticated. But anyway, I was going to just basically say that there are things that Britain might learn from the South African constitution, which, if it is going to go the constitutional route, it should have a look at how we've done it, because it's certainly better than the American constitution. But do not look, the state of government, and I'm including the judiciary in South Africa at the moment, is deplorable. It's pathetic. The writing's on the wall. But the fundamental structures and institutions, although they have been largely hollowed out and corrupted, still represent probably the best system that has ever existed in law and government. The level of debauchery and debasement that we have suffered, is all post essentially the Mandela regime. The degeneration has been quite fast. But that is fundamentally, I would say, also because of what I would call the first sin of the new South Africa. Because no one cares to look at these things. They only look at the apartheid system, but they don't look closer to the immediate cause of the problems that we face in this country. The immediate cause is that we only had a national government of unity for 2 years, when that should have easily been extended to much longer. Because the ANC government that took over was not as efficient as it could have been if we had a longer government of national unity. So we had people that were not qualified taking on roles, and effectively also facilitating corruption, although they have gotten progressively better at extracting government funds and stealing money, especially from the electricity company, which is why we don't have electricity effectively. We don't have a stable electricity source. The looting of the state, the theft, which is fundamentally facilitated by the breakdown of the rule of law, and that I mean quite specifically has to do with how everything is done by discretion of an administrator. Because there's so much discretion in the government handing out licenses, effectively they have controlled all of the big business, because no big business can speak out against them, because then they won't get the next mining license. So everything works effectively through bribery. Nothing is done in the national interest. Nothing is done according to a coherent policy that has objective criteria. It's all done by discretionary power. That's the which is completely unconstitutional as well. But the Constitutional Court does not give a damn, and it should be seen as a contiguous creature of the corrupted state. It's part of the whatever it is. I mean, I have my own theory that the Rainbow Nation, even with its early days of what even I call the original sin of only having a government of national unity for 2 years, when if the national interest was put first, that would have been extended to longer. But they actually wanted to get to the corruption faster, is actually the more underlying reason as to why it wasn't extended. Because for a time it was actually, there was a push to try and extend it, but it was defeated by the sort of the black pride people within the ANC. That's who it was defeated by. The same corrupt, disgusting people that you can imagine that now have corrupted the morality of the state entirely, and get to scapegoat their destruction and plundering. That even with that, the model of the Rainbow Nation seemed very successful in the 90s. And South Africa has prestigious universities. All the African elite send their children to South African universities. And they come to South Africa and they see a prospering, developing Rainbow Nation. The model of the Rainbow Nation was putting Africa to shame, because in all these other African countries, they had their blackness revolutions where they just trashed everything that was left by the colonizers, and where they, in all the, there's so many African nations that foment these tribal antagonisms, and effectively their political leadership, they're like mafia, they sell protection to their own people. That's what they do, and then they get to be the policemen that then get to control the resources, and then they set up themselves as political elites. And so the model of the Rainbow Nation, which was basically put that shit aside, forget about your group for a second, and let's just get on with it, basically. Let's just do what we can with what's available. Let's do the efficient thing. Let's do the thing that will actually cause the development fastest, or something like that. That we had enough of that spirit in the system. We had enough of that goodwill, which now has been completely displaced by a sabotaged economy, by an unrelenting assault, effectively, and a hollowing out of a very cynical and corrupt political elite that have the system of cadres which make it almost impossible to remove the institutional corruption that exists within the ruling party. If the public protector wanted to be honest, they should ban the ANC, or they should at least give the title, the legal ownership of the ANC to one good person in the ANC to kind of re-coalesce the party and to sort of divide people from the general party and to sift them into some kind of structure that has some integrity. But black National Socialism is pretty much like German Workers' Socialist Party. That's the form that fascism comes in. It's always clothed in the left. The people have a very short historical memory. Fascism doesn't market itself as being right-wing. It has always used left-wing rhetoric, although it's usually quite obvious, just how cynical and manipulative it really, how thin a veneer it is, that they want to expropriate land, but they don't want to give the ownership away. They want to keep it under the state, sort of control. Anyway, where was I going with that? I was talking about the history. Oh, I was talking about perhaps an explanation as to why we are in the state that we are in. So, I mean, I have a theory that these African elites that exist in other African countries who didn't like the Rainbow Nation, who didn't like what the Rainbow Nation represented to their own polity, to their own political economies, they didn't like the pressure that they were internally feeling because of the moral weight that the model of the Rainbow Nation represented. And, they just get the right amount of toxic academics and they kind of import them into the country and, like termites, essentially. The Rainbow Nation was... look, we always did have these toxic elements existed from the start. Winnie Mandela, a vile woman, a disgusting woman who is a murderer. Not just a murderer, a torturer. You have to imagine burning someone to death. That's what exists inside these people. Look, yes, she was harassed and she was mistreated by South African police. So you could say that, she was redirecting her internal trauma. But the kind of, anyway, whatever her origin story is for her nefarious, I shouldn't say this directly, but she is someone who I know. I have spoken to her. I know the kind of evil that is. It's a very kind of toxic borderline personality disorder, which is somewhat emblematic of the kind of the group narrative. It's very good at deploying narrative and being a field marshal in the narrative. But forcing life to conform to that rubric is so toxic. How it pretends to be responsible, but it's really projecting that responsibility as a very fabricated and fragile model of how things causally impinge on one another, and it really has to project these static relations onto things and onto people, and it really objectifies them in a racially essentialist way. It has all these things which it excuses of itself. It has all these dehumanizing generalizations that it excuses of itself. It really is everything that it complains about, ironically and disgustingly. And it's usually quite violent when you bring this up. When you confront this about it, then it's sort of, then you really see how fascistic it is. How easy it is at reweaving and respinning. It can take on board a tremendous amount of complexity and just kind of redeploy it in terms of the same underlying roles that it needs, and sort of it just finds new descriptions to deploy the same meta drama that it's infusing into its projection effectively. And it's completely blind to how it actually, well, I mean, when I say blind, I mean in terms of what it says, but I mean, you know that it doesn't actually, it's not really blind to it. It knows what it's doing. This form of pathology. It's self-aware, but it has this line that it takes in speaking this narrative, that is making so many revisions and so many redeployments and restructuring that it is utterly, it's a marvel at double speak and backpedaling. It's sort of, you almost have to absorb the kind of the Orwellian description of double speak and all those things in 1984 in terms of language control, because it's the most, to be seduced and hypnotized into that kind of I mean, I just call it dishonesty. I mean, it's sort of like dishonesty that gets papered over when it is being performed, and when it is sort of via social manipulation, it is supported and sympathized with. And this is how a better way to, I mean, anyway, I'm going to stop the recording, but I think I'll end this off. What's funny though is that even if you let it have everything that it wants, if you let it get away with itself, it actually needs resistance to make itself real. It's weird, but it actually needs something to fight against it so that it can continue to self-agonize and divert that self-sabotage as proof of and vindicating its narcissistic injury, and in continuing to correlate everything into the causative narrative that correlates to some history. So it is a weird ideology that sort of just endlessly repeats history.